All right, amazing. Hi, everyone. Sorry, hello. Sorry for making you stop talking. I know. Wow, it's a big room. Anyway, hello. I'm MJ Widomska. I'm the director and founder at Yours Truly. We're an award-winning ethical agency for games and tech. My talk is going to be about whether your gaming business can be a force for good and taking first steps towards sustainability. Obviously, I run a small to medium-sized business. It's not going to be applicable to anyone who has like a really complicated supply chain or anything like it, but it's going to give you some ideas about what you can do, how you can do it, what others are doing, what we are doing, and essentially how we can get started if you really want to make a change. So before we kind of move on, we really need to essentially define what sustainability even means, because I know it's a term that's like really thrown around, and I think a lot of people think it means different things. Essentially, the first kind of big like misconception about it is that people think that sustainability means like equals environmentally friendly, like that those kind of words can be used interchangeably, which isn't necessarily true, because while being environmentally friendly is a really big part of being sustainable, it's by no means like everything that it is, right? So a definition of sustainability that I really like is essentially ensuring that your needs don't compromise the ability of future generations to meet theirs. That's a really neat one. And when we're thinking about a sustainable business, it's essentially a business that's from an economic, from a social, and from an environmental standpoint, a business that can be sustained long term, right? Like can be viable for a really long term. So I have stolen this off the internet. It's really neat, and it really kind of shows you how all of the three elements of sustainability kind of come together, and how you really have to kind of take into consideration every single one of them for you to kind of count, I guess, as a sustainable business, or for sustainability to be kind of the thing that you're doing. So, like you can see from here, you can be a viable business, which means that you're environmentally friendly and, economically stable and financially secure. But as long as you don't also look at kind of your social impact, you're not yet a sustainable business. So kind of having those definitions is really helpful, because sustainability can be seen as a very kind of narrow thing, right? Which it really isn't. And you're going to really have it's really difficult to say a business is sustainable or not sustainable, because there also isn't like a grading scale. You know what I mean? Like it isn't that like you're either like 0% sustainable or 100% sustainable. So looking further into those kind of three elements of sustainability, you're going to have with environment, you're going to have the very basic thing of complying with environmental legislation, which seems basic, but it's, as we all know, not a thing that a lot of big companies do. And then, of course, from kind of that point onward, you want to set environmental goals that go above and beyond legislation, right? Like you're going to see this with companies pledging to, for example, be net zero by like X year. This is essentially doing that. And then this all encompasses, reducing emissions. And that can really kind of work in different ways. Every business is different. Every business generates waste differently. So this is really kind of for you individually to consider. Then economy, because another big misconception about sustainable businesses is that those are not businesses that are profitable, or that like profit is of any importance to them, which is not generally true, because you need to be viable. You need to be able to exist over a long period of time. So you have to be able to make profit. The difference between a business that prioritizes sustainability and a business that kind of prioritizes growth is that you don't grow in an uncontrollable way. You don't kind of you don't put environment or your employees at risk to grow and kind of meet financial demands. So while you still remain profitable, your profit and exponential growth of profit is not your main goal. And this kind of comes to play through risk management. And I think that, a lot of business owners are going to be very familiar with the concept of, being offered a really amazing chance to kind of like take your business to double its headcount or double its profit or whatever. But while kind of traditionally you'd be encouraged to take this opportunity, when you're trying to be a bit more sustainable with how your business is being run, you're going to ask yourself, could I meet those goals in, let's say, 10 years by sustainably kind of growing slowly year by year? And what are the strings attached to this like amazing deal that I'm giving, right? So like, would it mean that if things don't go the way I planned them, I'm gonna need to let my employees go, or the quality of my product is going to deteriorate? There's a lot that can happen if you're taking like big business risks, and being sustainable is essentially really making sure that you're not potentially hurting your company, hurting your staff, hurting your customers in the process. And then increasing efficiency and reducing labor waste. This is important because, and I'm going to talk a little bit about like the cross of economy and society, but a sustainable business needs to make sure that their product is good, right? I think like, a case we've all seen over and over again in the games industry is having resources pooled and put into making a game, having hundreds of people working on a game that then through, bad management, through unsustainable work policies, etc., the game just isn't great and the game doesn't sell, right? That's a massive waste. That's a waste of resources. That's a waste of labor. That's a really kind of, that a company that kind of does this, that puts out a game that has been made unsustainably, creates like a massively negative impact on the environment, or on their staff, on the industry as a whole. So like a big part of sustainability is also making sure that your product is good. So with society, what we're kind of looking at here is essentially your employees plus your consumers, like your customers, plus kind of your impact on your local society, local community. The very first thing, I'm going to talk about it a little bit in more detail, but fair wages. It's extremely crucial that a sustainable business pays their employees fairly. That's the first thing you need to do. It's also ensuring employees from underrepresented groups are included, but also that they are heard, that they are kind of given the same opportunities that other would have been given, and then advocating for your staff and customers as well, which kind of ties into making your product really good, making your employees really happy. With everything that I said here, I know this all might seem really daunting right now, but the important thing that there is like no perfection. This isn't like a scale from 0 to 100. Like no business can be truly like 100% sustainable. And there's two things that I see people kind of do when they think about, sustainability or becoming more sustainable, whether individually or as a business, and that they either, get so overwhelmed by like the enormity of the task that they are like, I can't even take the first step, which is bad because you're supposed to take that first step. So you really don't want to kind of get yourself in a headspace where like every action seems too small. No action is too small, especially when done by a business. Sure, individually as people, we probably have very little impact about, what happens with global warming. However, a business is, every action taken by a business is so much more impactful than an action taken by individuals. So even the smallest stuff is really going to matter. And the second thing I also see is that people would be really like nitpicky with, any sustainability things that like companies are doing, which is, I understand, because a lot of them, we're very aware of greenwashing, and a lot of time it is greenwashing, but we also don't want you to kind of like think about, oh, if I do this and like talk about it, people are going to think that like I'm fake or like I'm greenwashing. Like essentially make sure that you remember that being sustainable is a journey that essentially has no end. It's something that's going to be ongoing, and you don't really need to kind of worry about if you're achieving perfection or if everything that you're doing is like ideal, right? So in case that doesn't it's not something that could convince you, you or your boss. So the first thing is like, why should your business care, right? Obviously, I think we're all aware here that like we want to avoid climate disaster. Hopefully, there is no denying that it's something that impacts us all. And realistically, I think we're all aware of the fact that, this isn't, again, it's not the actions of like individual consumers that got us into this mess. It's the action of companies that have been, and heavy industry that has been kind of ignoring legislation and ignoring the science for like decades, right? So because we know that companies kind of got us into this mess, it's great to kind of see yourself and see a business as a way of like maybe reversing the trend, maybe kind of showing that business can be done in a different way. And then the other thing is from like more of like a business, I guess, side is obviously recruitment and retention. Being sustainable means having sustainable work practices, which in turn means that it's going to be a lot easier for you to retain staff and to recruit staff. And the important thing about, having a sustainable business is like, well, I'm sure like everyone here, myself included, have like career hopped a little bit in the past. Like a lot of like Zoomers and Millennials and Gen X as well, like don't really stay in a role for a very long. It's not a thing that kind of happens anymore. In a sustainable business, you ideally want to keep your employees for a really long time. You want to train them internally. You want to kind of promote them internally, because that's how you're able to build like a really strong and like a stable business. And then long-term consumer trust. So obviously, I think that this is something we've, like I work in marketing, we've been talking about this for a really long time, but we're seeing millennials and Zoomers specifically, the generations that are kind of taking over the market right now in terms of size, are the generations that are concerned about this stuff and that are essentially willing to, that would prefer to work for a company that cares, and prefer to buy from a company that cares. And it's a really important kind of factor of it, that like you might think that you can ignore this right now, but in 10 years it's going to seriously impact your bottom line if you do. So it's essentially like even the biggest businesses can't afford to ignore this, and we can hope that they take action. So a big thing is, I think that like in the games industry, I've seen a little bit of apathy when it comes to sustainability, primarily because I think people still have like a really outdated view of like who a gamer is. And when I tell people that like gamers are more likely to be vegetarian, that like overwhelmingly gamers think that they're being impacted by like climate change, people kind of tend to have this like view of like a gamer being, like a specific person. They don't think that this is true. But actually, like, people who play video games are a fairly kind of progressive audience that care about this sort of stuff. And you are going to, in the games industry, it's really easy to kind of alienate your consumer base by essentially not meeting them where they're at and not kind of understanding what they want. And again, like Gen Z, 62% of them prefer to buy from sustainable brands, and 73% are willing to pay more for sustainable products as well. That's like a massive, it's a massive chunk of the population. So with that in mind, I'm going to take you through some of the things that are kind of happening now or have been happening in like the last year, let's say. So Microsoft wants to go carbon negative by 2030 and remove produced carbon from the atmosphere by 2050. The little caveat here is that we actually don't really have a lot of like scientific evidence about how like removing carbon from atmosphere works. The first thing that you really want to do is reduce your emissions right now, because carbon removal, carbon offsetting stuff you see when you fly, and like an airline is like offset this flight and stuff like that. We don't really know how effective this sort of stuff is, right? So, keep that in mind as you're kind of looking at stuff like this, which doesn't mean that this isn't like a fantastic step anyway. Another thing from Microsoft, this is really, really neat. They're releasing a sustainability toolkit for game devs to essentially reduce carbon emissions through looking at the energy consumption of their game. This is really, really neat, because I think this is something that it's just not a thing that like is in the toolkit of like game devs right now anyway, like looking at how to essentially improve performance and make performance more efficient for climate reasons. But this is a really cool way for, devs to be able to do that. So, this is really neat. Another thing is, again, Microsoft producing a controller that's partially made from reclaimed materials. It's only 33%, obviously, but it's a lot better than 0%. And this is the first time I can remember seeing like something like a controller made from partially reclaimed materials. So I'm hoping that, if this kind of test goes well for them, because that's just been, I think, a few months ago, that we're going to see a lot more kind of reusing of materials, because let's face it, hardware is one of the ways that we, as an industry, are really kind of emitting hardware, and obviously streaming cloud energy consumption. So Sony, similarly to Microsoft, aiming to reduce environmental footprint to 0 by 2050. This is really neat. I'm really excited about this. So Sports Interactive essentially moved away completely from plastic packaging, and they are now, like, their physical games are now in a like a recycled cardboard box that like looks really, really cool. I don't really remember when games used to be in cardboard, but I know games used to be in cardboard. We need to bring that back. That was very fun. Another one, Astu, who are a B Corp. It's not only their game not only has like environmental messaging, but they also have a thing where like they plant one tree for each purchase, which is also, you know, super, super neat. So with that in mind, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what we do. So this is going to be a little bit more granular because obviously I have a lot more insight into what I do than what Sonny does. So I'm going to start by saying we're a certified B Corporation, and B Corporations are essentially a community of like-minded businesses that believe that business can be a force for good. B Corps are fairly common. I think you're going to see them a lot in like food industry, for example. They're not very common in games. I know we're the only like games agency that's a B Corp like in the world. I know in the UK, Astu are a B Corp, but a B Corp is independently certified as a company that like meets the highest standards of like environmental and societal, essentially like sustainability, right? Of like positive impact. The process takes a really long time. For us, it took 1.5 years. It was very painful. I had to collect a lot of documentation. Very sad. But the way you kind of do it, the way you go through kind of the impact process is you get graded in 5 categories: governance, workers, community, environment, and customers. And you need to submit documentation, you need to go on calls, you need to kind of show what you're doing. And the reason why I'm talking about this is you don't need to, you don't pay for it until the very end when you want to kind of be certified, right? So like anyone can go do this. And while this is a lot of questions to answer, it's really neat at showing you how your business is doing and like where you can maybe potentially like improve. And the cool thing about being a B Corp is that like your entire score gets published on the website. And as you have to get recertified every 3 years, it's essentially going to show you like how the company is going up or down. And then again, a company, you know, getting a worse score than they did 3 years ago doesn't necessarily mean that like they're doing like horribly badly right now. Like sustainability is a journey. So a median score for like an ordinary business that takes the assessment, which, you know, we can already assume that those are businesses that do care a little bit more about sustainability, given that they are doing the sustainability assessment, is going to be 50.9. 80 qualifies for a big corporation. We've got 94.7, which is very cool. I hope we're going to get over 100 next time. We'll see. But the cool thing is like it has complete transparency, right? And transparency is one of the biggest kind of, I guess, features of trying to be a sustainable business for us. So this is going to be wild to a lot of you, I think. But we publish our salaries every single year. So we're, you know, obviously I talk a lot about fair and transparent pay, and I talk a lot about it because I've seen people be really severely underpaid in the games industry and in marketing and agencies as well. And I just don't, you know, I don't want to run the kind of a business where my juniors earn 22 to 23K and like can barely make ends meet, essentially. So we are looking at, we give everyone kind of an update on like how our salaries are looking kind of over time. And anyone who's, and like we have essentially like an ethics page on our website, and no one who works at the company full-time past their probation will earn less than 30K, and no one at like an intern level is going to earn less than like a local living wage to where they live. So we also choose to be inclusive in every aspect of business. This is also a really important thing because we want to make sure that the inclusivity and like the diversity comes through, and it's a really cool way to essentially, you know, make sure that you have new stories and that like your product and like your services are really cool because you're getting a lot of different people who think differently kind of coming together. But for us, it's like, you know, we work with a diverse group of content creators, but we also do video shoots. And when we do that, we make sure that both in front of the camera and behind the camera, we have a diverse group of people. We also support like-minded businesses. So B Corps are great because that means you can essentially always look at your suppliers and be like, can I find a supplier that's a little bit more, you know, whose values are a little bit more aligned with ours? We integrate within our local community. We, weirdly enough, I know a lot of people like now want to have physical offices, but I love having a physical office. We've had a physical office since we started 6 years ago. So we're in Hackney, in London Fields, in London, and we try to essentially make sure that we are part of the community. You know, we work with local charities. We get involved in like local events. We, you know, work with local suppliers. We make sure that our presence in the area isn't like a black hole of essentially like bringing people in to, you know, generating traffic towards the area, but not really kind of like leaving anything of note ourselves. So I think that that's like a really important part of it for us. We say no to uncontrollable growth. So this is also a really big one, because I have like a lot of other business owners have been kind of put in a situation where like I could double my headcount, but I knew that I would lose what we have now, and I would put like my company culture at risk. I don't know if I would be able to like create the management structure that I would need to double the headcount, all of that, right? So I think that like we say no a lot, which is also quite rare for agencies that often, you know, have to kind of take whatever work is coming in. But I'd rather, you know, I'd rather cut my own salary than like do something that I think is going to hurt the company or that's going to be really unsustainable over long term. And then we prioritize employee well-being. So everything else kind of comes into it, but it's stuff like making sure that people feel, you know, people are managed and they feel supported, and we have documentation, and they don't have to kind of second guess their managers or, you know, second guess like their superiors, or like try to figure out what people want from them. Everything is very clear. Everyone feels very financially secure. You know, they feel like they have kind of like an opportunity to grow. We're very big on making sure that like people get promoted and grow and like, you know, go to training and like get educated and all of that sort of stuff. Like we really kind of invest in the people that we have. And, you know, we do things like having a 4-day work week, though from very recently, but I'll talk about it more in a little bit. So if you want to do better, here's like a very quick recipe or how you can kind of do it, right? So the first thing you want to do is you want to audit. It doesn't have to be super, super thorough. It might be just like one part of what you're doing, but you want to know where you're kind of at right now. Doing the B Corp assessment is really good if you want to have like an overall like view of like what's happening with your business. Then you want to plan. So some things can happen really quickly, but some things really can't. And this is why you really need to make sure that you have a plan, genuinely like a month by month, like a week by week thing. So this actually happens because, you know, especially when you're busy in a busy period, stuff like this can really be sidetracked. So you want to make sure that there's like a solid plan that people are sticking to. You want to consult. So a good thing is to get an outside consultant, especially if you have any like, you know, complicated stuff like supply chains or suppliers that, you know, maybe are not sharing your values, whatever it is. But you also want to make sure that you're getting your employees involved, because they're, you know, they're going to be the people who are going to be implementing those changes. So you really want to get them excited. So you can essentially get your employees to be really into what you're doing by, first of all, you know, considering a move towards a greater work-life balance. It could be a 4-day working week. It could be more flexible work. It could be a different work from home policy. You really can kind of do a lot. And then can invest in education. That's a big one. You want to make sure that people understand why you're doing certain things and people are on the same page with you. I think that, you know, we know that some people don't care about this stuff as much as others, which is, you know, fine, but we want to make sure that they understand why you're taking those steps and they're kind of with you on this, right? Like you want to really have like a unified team on this, and then give them ownership. I think that like what we've noticed is like we've been doing things a certain way for a while, and when we started looking at how we could become a bit more sustainable, what we've noticed is like people were really excited about changing things, because that meant changing processes that we've had for years, right? And that meant that like they could make changes to make things more efficient and easier for themselves, while at the same time kind of tweaking them to be a bit more sustainable. The fourth thing is you want to implement. So start small, make a gradual change, and make sure that everyone kind of feels a shared responsibility for your goals. And then reporting. So this is a big one because you're supposed to report a little differently to how you usually report. Again, we're a marketing agency, so whenever we report, we always try to kind of make the campaign and ourselves look really good, right? With a B Corp, with a sustainability reporting, you're supposed to make yourself look bad, because this is about kind of ensuring that you're kind of picking things that you want to do next, right? Like you're figuring out where else you can improve. This is essentially a journey. So like when you're reporting for a sustainability report, you really want to kind of make yourself look a little bad. And then, so you need to kind of figure out your metrics, right? Is it employee retention, financial health, employee performance, waste generated? It's definitely going to involve some spreadsheets. Then you can gather data, you can use softwares and questionnaires, get your accountants involved. For us, it's stuff like financial health and kind of employee retention, right? So I do get my accountant involved a lot. I don't think he really likes it, but you're gonna have different kind of people in your team or different software they can use to kind of get people involved. And then review and publish. So again, like obviously you don't have to publish it publicly if you don't want to. You can just kind of send it over to your employees or to like an outside consultant that you're working with, but don't kind of be afraid of anything that puts you in a negative light, because you're gonna see with every report and as you're doing this that things are kind of getting better and better. And then the last thing is repeat. Something that I've noticed while working on the B Corp assessment is I thought we were doing so well before I started doing the B Corp assessment, and then I realized in how many ways we're not doing as well as I thought. So that essentially means that after doing that, I kind of had to repeat this process over and over again as I kept noticing new things that we could maybe do in a more like efficient or sustainable way. So here's kind of the practical steps that you can take now-ish. And I'm going to start with the kind of the obvious. Every single one of them has a cat picture, by the way. That actually took me a really long time to find. So checking your suppliers. It's really important that as you are kind of moving towards being a more sustainable business, that you're not kind of in a situation where you're working with like the worst supplier ever who like underpays their staff or like doesn't pay their staff or whatever. And I think that like we've all seen kind of stories of like, really poorly run outsourced like QA departments or something like that who were like treating their staff really poorly, and like the output was bad and like the company was made to look bad. Like, like you essentially want to really do whatever you can to avoid this sort of a situation. So there's so much you can do in terms of your suppliers. I think that the one thing when I speak to kind of business owners who have been running their businesses for longer than I have been running mine, is that they're going to be like, yeah, but we worked with the same supplier for like 10 years. And I'm like, there's so many new people, like so many new suppliers that have popped up in this time that you might have not kind of realized are even out there. And I see this, like we see this a lot when people come to us as an agency. We're 6 years old, so we're a fairly new agency, and people be like, I've worked with the same agency for 15 years. I didn't even know like how many things have changed in terms of like what you can kind of get from your suppliers and stuff like this. So it's really make it essentially like a habit to check if you're working with someone for a really long time and you don't think they share your values, can you maybe work with someone else? And then also something that I do if I'm working with a supplier, they love that question. I will ask them, what's the gap between like the lowest paid worker and like the highest paid worker in their company? Like if I'm, entering like a really long and intense relationship, and I'm unsure about them, I will ask them certain questions to make sure that like we're on the same wavelength. Because like essentially, I don't want to give money to a company that I think is doing more harm than good, right? Like this is what it's all about, right? Making sure that your impact on the people, the planet, etc., is generally positive. The second thing, very controversial, swapping to vegetarian and vegan food. So I've been vegetarian for 15 years. I feel like I give off the energy. I feel like you could tell. But so we have like a company policy that essentially means that like we don't buy like like we try to not buy animal like products in general, but we don't buy meat like at all, right? Like if someone's going to a conference like this and we have like 5 people, 6 people going from the company, they can't have a Big Mac if they like buy it themselves, but if they want to use the company card, and everyone does, obviously, they're gonna have to kind of buy vegetarian food. And the thing is, people think it's such a small thing, but making a small change like this, it doesn't have to be all of the time. You don't have to be as strict about it as I am, but making the choice to go to like a cool new fancy vegan restaurant instead of taking your team out for a steak is going to be, it can make such a big impact, because you're essentially, the reason why we're saying so much more vegetarian and vegan products now is because people have been consistently asking for them. There's been a bigger and bigger market growing for people who don't want to eat animal products, right? So, and the other thing about it is, like, while I understand 10 or 20 years ago, some people might be really apprehensive about like eating a non-meat diet, or like, going to a non-meat restaurant at work, that the way that like meat replacement stuff works now is like you can't tell. I went with my mom to a vegan restaurant and she doesn't speak English, so she didn't know. And I've never told her, and she still doesn't know. So she thinks she had meat, but she just doesn't know, and she will never know. So please don't tell her if you see her. And then the other thing is, I could talk about this for ages, because again, I really like trains. Another thing I feel like I give off, but I feel like I see a lot of people fly to destinations that you really don't want to like fly to. I don't know if people enjoy flying. I really don't. I think it's having to queue at the airport and having to go to the airport, which is always like super inconveniently located, and then like make your way back is always like a massive pain. And we just had TwitchCon this weekend, where I've seen people who live in London fly from London to Paris. That's wild, because you can take a train for less money and it's going to be quicker and it's going to be a lot more convenient. I think people have this like switch when they travel, which is like, work travel. I'm traveling out of the country, time to like, get on a plane because I live on an island. However, we now have a way off this island by train, and it's really convenient to go to Paris, to go to Amsterdam, where TwitchCon was last year, to go to Gamescom. We always go by train. It takes less than 4 hours, and it's really fun. And it's a lot cheaper. And I think that, people don't really kind of think about this sort of stuff. I understand that people who live in the north of the country might have issues kind of commuting to London, where like Eurostar leaves from, because of, the train connections not being great. But I think this is even more of like a reason to kind of ask for and lobby for and want, better train connections, so we can actually not have to always rely on flying, which is inconvenient and not fun. And the other thing about sustainable travel, which I think a lot of people didn't realize, because when I talk to people about it, they're like, oh, I had no idea, is to choose hotels instead of Airbnbs. So I think some people might already know that like Airbnbs have a really kind of negative impact on a lot of cities. If you've ever been to Barcelona and you were like, wow, why does everyone hate tourists here? It's because Airbnbs have essentially like people running Airbnbs have bought up all of the like cheap flats in the city center and made it impossible for actual people who want to live there. And this is happening. Barcelona is like a really big example. Like I feel like a lot of people know about it, but this is happening everywhere. I know that a lot of people know about what's happening in Wales, with Welsh people being kind of driven out of the areas where like they want to live because of Airbnbs and like holiday rentals. So because hotels are usually purpose-built as hotels, it's almost always a better choice. And you can also find kind of sustainable hotels, or hotels that are a little bit more kind of have a little bit more care towards sustainability. So that's another way to kind of make sure that your travel is a little bit different. You can also become a living wage employer, which is really important, because I don't think it should be a controversial, statement, but if anyone's working to create profit for your company, they should be paid as the bare minimum, right? Because I know a lot of interns don't get paid at all, but not only they should be paid, but they should be able to make ends meet, especially if you're running a business where you want you want people to come to your office, and your office, let's say is in central London, you need people who live in London. You need to make sure that those people are able to live in London, right? So this is why living wage exists, which is essentially, I think the highest in the UK is in London, and it's £12 an hour. And that essentially means that, this gets adjusted every year, but this means that like this is kind of the minimum that a person can make to like live in London and like be able to like live and like feed themselves and like not struggle, right? I think as an employer, people like, employers should also think about things like inflation and cost of living crisis. I know some business, I can't remember which games companies, but there's been several games companies that have actually like given a percentage rise or given like a one-off kind of like an add-on essentially to people's salary. We've done this as well last year, where like, because of inflation, you're not, this isn't really a raise, you're just adjusting people's pays to what actually was worth like 2 years ago. And another thing is trialing a 4-day week or a 9-day fortnight. So we've been doing, I think that like if you're a little bit apprehensive about a 4-day week, like I was, because we're always really busy, and I was like, how are we going to pull this off? We've done a 9-day fortnight for about a year before we moved to a 4-day working week. And that made me realize that like all of the fears that I had of like, what if a client wants something from us on a Friday, or like, what if the week is really intense or whatever. This has never happened. We have never had to work on Friday when we're doing a 9-day fortnight. So eventually we moved to a 4-day week in May, and the only side effect I can see is like Monday to Thursday is a lot more intense. But then like I don't have time to go on Twitter during work, which is really sad for me. But then I can make up for it by going on Twitter a lot on Friday, so this is fine. And obviously, like the 4-day trial had. 4-day week trial has ended a few months ago in the UK, had like fantastic results, right? Business from like across like different industry. No, there were some gaming businesses in there as well. 92% of companies decided to stay on the 4-day work week after it ended, right? So this clearly works. And I can tell you from like our perspective, this has not diminished our profits. This has only made our employees happier. And then a big one, recycling e-waste and buying secondhand. So people don't know this, but if you buy stuff like manufacturer refurbished, it's literally like buying new stuff, except that it's cheaper and more sustainable. So I think that like we used to work with GiveGuff a lot, the mobile network, and their whole thing is like they have like a manufacturer refurbished phones that you can buy off their website. And I actually went to the factory where they do it because we did like a shoot there to like show it, and it's really cool. It's really neat. Like they really minimize waste and like test it and like change everything that they need to change. And like at the end of it, you come out with like a new looking phone that like works perfectly well, except that it's like 40% cheaper than a new phone. Same with like Apple. Like a lot of like our Apple stuff comes from like the Apple like manufacturer refurbished like section, and you can get this cheaper and it's a lot more sustainable. Big ways that businesses generate waste is e-waste. Because people don't really know how to recycle this, and every council has a different way of recycling stuff. So if we really have something that's like really broken down, and this has happened several times because some of us are really clumsy. If we like know that like there's like no fixing this, then we just call our council and we're like, help, please tell me what do we do with this? And they tell us what to do with it to make sure that we're not like generating unnecessary e-waste. But usually you can get it repaired, and usually you can get it like essentially you can get it like donated after it's repaired or something like that. And then the last thing is going to be joining a movement. So there is a bunch of them that you can kind of participate, and this is not a very exhaustive list, but essentially you want to make sure that, especially, as you're kind of moving towards sustainability, you want to ensure two things: that you're keeping yourself accountable, there's someone keeping you accountable, right? And that you're not verging on the edge of greenwashing, right? Because I have seen businesses, even in the games industry, who say, we're an ethical something, but you try to find out ethical how, and there's no information, right? So I think that like people are like, oh, people want to work with like ethical businesses now, let me call myself one, but not actually do anything about it. So joining a movement is great because someone keeps you accountable, but you can also show your credentials. You can be like, hey, here's what we actually do. We're a part of this. We're doing stuff with them. So the first one is Playing for the Planet, which has been doing a lot of good. They've been working with, this is the organization that like helps Sports Interactive move away from plastic packaging completely. And there's also Yuki's very own Raise the Game pledge. There is also the sustainability group, which I didn't know existed until like 2 days ago. So I will be joining that. They meet every 8 weeks, apparently. Of course, B Corp, again, with a caveat of, I know B Corp is a big undertaking. It is worth it. It's great to be a part of this community. It's very, it's very kind of heartening to know that there's people who like kind of run their businesses like you do. It's a big process, but I think just starting it, just doing the assessment, convincing your boss or like your manager, doing it yourself, it's going to be really helpful. And then climate neutral is another thing that you can do, which is a lot more focused on the kind of the environmental friendliness, essentially. So those are the kind of the communities you can join. And I strongly recommend that if you are a business, if you are thinking about being more sustainable, this is one of the coolest things you can essentially do is, joining a movement, being kept accountable, showing that you have kind of the credentials to, do what you're doing. And that is it. Thank you very much. Does anyone have any questions? I hope. Yeah, go ahead.
Do you have any thoughts on the ethics of how games are monetized and some of the problems with kind of loot boxes and gambling, and also,
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not a huge fan of, like, definitely, and I'm not a huge fan of, like, gambling mechanisms in games. I do think there is some, like, nuance to what actually is gambling and what isn't. Like, I can see a lot of, like, I know that, like, Yuki have been working on, like, I think like a very well thought out kind of response to everything that's kind of been happening about this conversation. I would never personally work with a company that has like really predatory kind of gambling mechanics, right? Like, because I would never work with a gambling company. So I think that like, I understand that we live in a society, and I understand that like games need to make money, and I understand that games are often kind of put in a situation where like they have to kind of monetize to extreme level because of like the shareholder pressures. But that doesn't change the fact that like, while I'm super okay with like cosmetics, and I'm super okay with like, paying for boosts or whatever in games, I think that like the line is crossed when it looks like gambling and it feels like gambling and it makes people feel like gambling. And I wouldn't personally work with a company that does something like this. Any more questions? Yeah, go ahead.
Just going to start because we might push for time. Hello, yeah. Thank you for the talk, and you've given a lot of examples of how your business is practicing sustainability. What I'm more curious is how to get there from being a position of unsustainability and towards sustainability, because sometimes when you're a new startup, I mean, Microsoft and Google can afford these kind of sustainability policies because they are big corporations that have made it, if it makes sense. But if I'm just a new company, new startup with a few micro indie team, to start as I mean to go on. I mean, I'm having sometimes to compete with bigger studios on having to outsource some of my work to lower wage countries such as Poland or Lithuania, some of the Eastern European countries, and even in extreme cases, outsourcing it to India or China, where the working conditions and sustainability practices are not as good, you could argue. Just wondering, without rambling on, how to go from a position of you need the sort of funds established, the basic survivability of the company before you can talk about sustainability, or is it your opinion that you start from the first step from the beginning to look at sustainability as a founding principle kind of sort of thing?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I feel like we're in a more of a similar position than I think you think, right? Because the difficult answer to this question is that like if you're finding yourself competing with for like resources from a company that's always looking to cut costs, like whatever kind of the quality of the end product is going to be, they're probably not going to be the right partner for you anyway, right? So like for us, we also, to a degree, we provide the service, and there are agencies that are a lot bigger than us that pay their staff really little, that have really bad kind of working policies, and that they can afford, they can give their services for a lot cheaper than we can, right? Because of like the wages that we have, etc. And the reality is, even if you do compete with someone like this, and you do kind of like win the account, you get money from them, you get funding, or you get like the marketing account or whatever, eventually, sooner or later, this isn't going to be like a nice long-term sustainable relationship, right? Eventually, you're going to find yourself in a situation where you're going to have to find someone else. So for me, obviously, sustainability has been a big part from like the very start for me, but I didn't also have like the funds to like make everything work like I wanted it to. I think the thing that I did is I invested a lot more time in things like business development, meeting people, etc. So I don't have to rely on working with companies that don't have don't share my values, essentially. And I know it's tricky, right? There is no easy solution to this. It's hard to kind of start from like this point and like move onwards, but it is certainly possible. And I think that like, while short term it might seem like you're struggling to get funds and like everything is a lot more difficult, you need to kind of think about like long term, assume that you're going to succeed and see where you want your business to be. And I think that like for us, we're lucky enough, after having to work for like businesses that I really didn't like working with, that we finally found like a client that we really shared like our values of those GiveGav, and we were them for a really long time, and that helped us kind of propel to kind of new heights, right? But it happened really slowly. It was like over 3 years we kind of grew really slowly, and like the relationship strengthened, right? So I think the important thing is try to find partners who will kind of share your values, because they do exist. Like all of our clients that we work with really big companies, like really like household names. Like our biggest clients are Wizards of the Coast and Magic and Dungeons and Dragons. They share our values completely. I know I can trust them, and I know that we have a long and like great relationship because we have the same values, right? So yeah, I think that this is a very like long and winded way to say that it's going to be hard in the beginning, but you have to kind of stick to your guns. And if you're finding yourself having to unfairly compete with, practices that you just can't, like, even if you tried, you can't offer certain services here as cheaply as you would in Poland. I know, I'm Polish, so like I know what the wages that are there. If you can't kind of unfairly compete with this ever. So you just have to look for a different partner that kind of understands that and wants the quality rather than like immediate savings, essentially. Yeah, no worries. Any questions? Oh yeah, sorry, go ahead.
I guess not really a question, but more an open discussion, really, to sort of get people thinking. Obviously, as developers, we release on platforms that are quite big, like maybe Amazon, for instance, and things like that. Personally, like on a personal level, try not to shop on Amazon because of the whole, we've got to shop local and support independent businesses and things. Just wondering if there's something more that developers could do to release in like independent game stores and things like that, that will benefit local communities more, and also maybe limit. Obviously, nobody wants to not sell on Amazon because that's like such a huge thing to sell on. And obviously, lots of games and people here sell on Amazon. But is there anything that we could encourage maybe strategically with all kinds of devs, where we reach out to more independent places to sell on? Or maybe things like, next day delivery is very enticing for consumers because, I can get this thing instantly. But you mentioned before how, we're going to go backwards. Let's get cardboard packaging back because, it's better for the environment. Is there anything maybe we should do to, we don't need games instantly? Is there like to admit that is like, we want to sell games instantly, we want to sell more and more and more, but should we maybe be encouraging consumers like, get this game, it might come in like a group delivery, it's a bit slower, but we should be respecting that, sometimes we should be more patient, or we can go to our local shop, get out the house, let's go and get this thing. Like, how do we have that conversation with sort of consumers and as developers to be like, we want the best thing that sells this thing, but also how do we encourage consumers to follow suit with that sort of thing as well?
I think this is obviously like a really big thing, right? Because there's this concept called degrowth, which essentially means that like really to kind of meet our like climate targets, what we need to do is like really limit consumption, right? So what you're kind of talking about, it's a difficult thing because once you give someone a privilege of like a next day delivery, it's really difficult to kind of take it away from them. So I think that like you can, what I see companies doing and I think is really neat is like if you give people a reason to wait, that's a great way to kind of encourage your consumers to choose more sustainable options. So for example, you can offer your product on Amazon with next day delivery, or they can order it directly from your website with like a more sustainable packaging, whatever, and they get like some sort of a bonus with ordering directly from you, right? Or with like things like you can go offer your game on like Itch or GOG or like Humble Bundle, and there might be some sort of like a special you can still get it from Steam, for example, but there might be some sort of like a special bonus from kind of getting them from like the more like independent, like, you know, different kind of storefronts. So it's a tough one because I agree. I think that like ultimately being more sustainable is going to mean giving up some of the things that like we have now. Like, you know, we can't really make sure like there's not enough resources to have an Amazon forever, right? Like this just like we just can't have that. We can't have next day delivery everywhere forever because we just don't have those resources. But at the same time, if we do want to get people to maybe not kind of participate in that sort of economy, then we need to kind of incentivize this essentially. So that's probably the best way to do it. That's it. No more questions. Sorry, no more questions. I've been told. But anyway, thank you so much for coming.